Welcome to Bringing Romans to Life. I'm Preston Burrows, and in this lesson, we'll consider some of the central features of first century Judaism, as well as a few important historical events that may have affected Jews in Rome. In this lesson, we'll consider a small fraction of the complexity of Judaism and the Jewish experience in the first century Roman Empire. First, we should note that the Greek term Judaioi has two layers of meaning. It is an ethnic and geographical term that would best be translated Judean or Judeans, it's a plural, but it's also a religious term that we often would translate as Jews. So this one Greek word can be translated in two relatively different ways in English. Judeans refers to those people who reside in or their ancestors came from Judea, and Jews usually refers to the people who worship the God of Israel. And that's people who reside in Judea or outside of it. It is sometimes unclear whether Paul primarily uses Judaioi to refer to the people from Judea or devotees of the Jewish religion. And sometimes it doesn't matter, but other times it possibly can. So we'll encounter this complexity as we engage with the letter of Romans. All right, so let's consider what Judeans, Jews might have thought in the first century. When the first century Judean, or we might call him Jew, with the name Josephus, you may have heard of him before, when he described the Jewish way of life for a Roman audience, he highlighted the Jewish practices of reading scripture and observing the law. These were the two really important aspects of Judaism. And following the law, of course, entailed many things, but one of the most notable practices involved praying to their God and worshiping God without the use of images. And this was quite unique in the ancient world, where statues and images of gods abounded. Another distinctive practice of the Jewish people was the worship of only one God. And this meant they were careful to avoid being associated with the religious practices of other peoples and other gods. Many Jews often also avoided eating the meat that was served at Roman civic festivals, holy days, since it likely came from animals that had been sacrificed to gods. And these gods, of course, Jews and Christians often called idols. What's more, the particular meat wouldn't have been kosher or allowed in the Jewish diet. So their peculiar diet stood out as well. Speaking of sacrifice, although Jews didn't sacrifice to Rome's gods, Jewish priests offered daily sacrifices on behalf of Rome's emperor. And this is for his health and well-being. And they offered these sacrifices, of course, in the Jerusalem temple until it was destroyed in 70 CE. They made other daily and annual sacrifices to their God as well. In order to support the temple, most Judeans or Jews throughout the known world sent a half shekel to the temple each year. They also brought first fruits and other offerings to the temple and its priesthood during pilgrimage festivals. And the Romans didn't interfere with this form of offering, any of these forms of offering. They didn't forbid Jews from traveling to Jerusalem for their 3 annual pilgrimages or festivals. They gave Jews the right to observe their religious customs. The observance of the law meant different things to different people at this time. But 3 central practices were observed in various ways by all devout Jews: circumcision, not working on Sabbath, and not eating pork. And as you can imagine, these practices made the Jewish people stand out among their non-Jewish neighbors. A Jewish scholar explains that no Jewish community in antiquity admitted uncircumcised males to membership. Uncircumcised men could attend religious activities alongside Jews, but such men were not considered fully part of the covenant community. They were not considered Jews or Judeans. Although a few may have questioned the validity of a male's circumcision after the 8th day of life, which is when Torah commands that circumcision be done, a Gentile man would convert to Judaism by becoming circumcised. And this meant in Judaism, religious devotion and practice overcame a person's ancestry. In other words, one's ethnic identity could change through conversion to Judaism. So one who wasn't Judean by blood could become Jewish. When we think or talk about first century Judaism, we must keep at the forefront of our minds that there wasn't a uniform religion called Judaism. In fact, by the time the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, there were at least 4 sects or flavors of Judaism, in addition to the diverse forms of religious expression practiced by common people. The sects were, of course, Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots. And we might add a 5th stream in this, and that would be Christianity. And you can learn more about these diverse approaches to living out the Jewish faith in my course on Second Temple Judaism, hopefully coming soon. In addition to all these depictions of Jewish practice, we need to highlight a couple important societal events that can inform our interpretation of Romans. In 38 CE, there was a large riot in Alexandria, Egypt. Some Greek-speaking mobs attacked Judeans, or the Jews there, who had lived in the city for decades, if not centuries. They had made their home there for a very long time. There were other violent events there in Alexandria, as well as in other cities, including Syrian Antioch. And on November 10th of 41 CE, Emperor Claudius wrote a letter to the Greeks and the Judeans in Alexandria and Syrian Antioch. Emperor Claudius insisted that the Greeks allow the Jews to practice their traditional religion as they had been for decades under the Roman rule, and to remind the Jews that they must not unsettle the social peace. If they did, they would lose their religious freedom to practice as their law dictated. It's difficult to know for sure, but it seems as though in 49 CE, Emperor Claudius ordered some Judeans in Rome to leave Rome. And we don't know all of what was happening, but it seems as though perhaps among the exiles or refugees from Rome may have been Prisca and Aquila. And they ended up meeting Paul in Corinth. Paul greets this particular couple in Romans chapter 16 several years after their eviction from Rome. So he probably wrote this letter of Romans around 56 to 58 CE, and that would have been a couple years after Emperor Claudius died, which was in 54 CE. Once he died, the Jewish refugees, the people who were expelled, would have been allowed to return to their homes in Rome if they still had homes there. So Paul probably wrote this letter a few years after Prisca and Aquila were able to return to their homes in Rome. Some scholars suggest that the expulsion of some Judeans from Rome included primarily Jesus followers who had proclaimed Jesus as the Christ. One of the sources talks about these people calling out about Christus instead of Christos, Christus. It's possible that when these Jewish Jesus followers left Rome, they left behind a power vacuum in the Christian gathering, in the house churches. The Gentile Jesus followers then, who had remained in Rome, perhaps filled this vacuum and directed congregational life in ways that ultimately didn't follow the strictest of Jewish standards. Then, when Jewish leaders returned to Rome several years later, it seems as though perhaps tension grew between the old leadership and the new. And it's perhaps this tension and the differences in practice that had resulted from Gentile leadership that Paul addresses in this letter. And we see this especially in chapter 14, where Paul discusses how the Christian communities can eat properly together with various eating preferences, especially those between strict Judean Jewish folks and more Gentile-leaning folks. And even if this scenario isn't quite what happened, it's likely that there was some sort of tension caused by something that was brewing between a stricter form of Jesus following Judeans, Jews, as well as potentially Gentiles, Gentiles who were very zealous about their new faith in the Jewish Messiah. And that this tension was threatening the unity of the Christian community in Rome. So now, before we consider to whom Paul wrote this letter in the next module, I'd like you to spend a few minutes responding to this module's prompts.